For more than 5 centuries, millions of families across Spain, Portugal, Latin America, and the American Southwest have unknowingly carried fragments of a hidden religious inheritance. Small, strange domestic habits passed down from grandmother to mother to daughter with no explanation attached. Customs that survived inside Catholic households for 15 or 20 generations after the people who first practiced them were forced, often under threat of torture or execution, to abandon Judaism in public and pretend it had never existed. This is not speculative folklore. It is one of the best documented phenomena in the history of religious persecution, and it has produced a body of genealogical, archival, and genetic evidence that is now allowing historians and geneticists to trace, with increasing precision, which families across the Iberian world descend from Jewish ancestors who converted, by force or by necessity, and never fully let go. The story behind this hidden inheritance begins in 1492, the same year Christopher Columbus sailed for the Americas, when the Spanish crown issued the Alhambra decree expelling all Jews who refused to convert to Catholicism. Portugal followed with its own expulsion order 5 years later, and in practice enforced an even harsher policy of mass forced baptism. Tens of thousands of Spanish and Portuguese Jews chose conversion over exile, becoming what the Spanish called conversos, and what their less sympathetic neighbors sometimes called marranos, a term whose etymology remains debated but whose intent was clearly derogatory. Many of these converts were sincere in their new Catholic identity, but a significant number were not, and they continued practicing Judaism in secret, in cellars and back rooms and walled-off chambers, passing rituals down through families who could never write any of it down, never speak of it to outsiders, and never be entirely certain which of their own neighbors might report them to the Inquisition. The Spanish and Portuguese Inquisitions spent close to 300 years actively hunting for exactly this kind of concealed practice, and in doing so, they generated an enormous archival record. Trial transcripts, denunciations, confessions extracted under interrogation, and detailed lists of the specific behaviors inquisitors considered evidence of secret Judaizing. Historians have spent the past several decades mining these records, alongside parish registers, cemetery surveys, and modern genetic studies, to reconstruct which customs actually persisted, in which regions, and for how long. What they have found is that the people who fled or were sent to the far edges of the Spanish and Portuguese empires, to remote mountain villages in northern Portugal, to colonial outposts in the Caribbean, and eventually to the most isolated reaches of what is now New Mexico and southern Colorado, often preserved fragments of Jewish practice precisely because they were so far from the watchful eye of church authorities that the old habits simply never had a reason to die out completely. What follows are 7 categories of evidence that historians, genealogists, and geneticists treat as genuinely meaningful indicators of crypto-Jewish ancestry. None of them, taken alone, proves anything with certainty. But taken together, in families where several of them appear at once, they form a pattern that serious researchers now consider real and worth investigating, in much the same way that a single anomaly in the soil means little, but a convergence of multiple independent anomalies starts to demand an explanation. The single most frequently documented domestic custom among crypto-Jewish families, recorded again and again in Inquisition trial records from Spain, Portugal, Mexico, and the Portuguese communities of Belmonte, that survived practicing Judaism in secret well into the 20th century, involves the lighting of candles on Friday evening in a room from which children were sometimes excluded, or which was kept curtained and closed to outside view. Inquisitors specifically trained their informants to watch for unexplained absence from work or cooking on Saturdays, for households that swept their floors and changed linens on Fridays without any stated religious reason, and for families who quietly avoided visible activity on what looked, to a trained eye, suspiciously like the Jewish Sabbath. This pattern did not disappear when the Inquisition itself eventually wound down in the early 19th century. Researchers studying Hispano communities in northern New Mexico throughout the 20th century, most notably the historian Stanley Hordes, who spent decades combing Inquisition archives in Mexico City and conducting oral history interviews with families in the American Southwest, documented dozens of households where elderly relatives could describe a grandmother who lit candles in a back room on Friday nights, sometimes in a coffee can, or beneath an inverted clay pot to hide the light from outside, with no living family member able to say why. The custom had simply been transmitted as an unquestioned domestic ritual, often performed by women specifically, stripped of any of the explanatory religious language that would have made its origin obvious. Families frequently describe this practice to researchers with genuine bewilderment, having always assumed it was simply something their family did, a private superstition rather than the last visible trace of a Sabbath candle-lighting tradition more than 4 centuries old. What makes this evidence credible to historians rather than merely anecdotal is the consistency of its documentation across 2 entirely separate channels: formal Inquisition prosecution records from the 16th, 17th, and 18th centuries on one hand, and independent 20th century oral history fieldwork conducted by researchers who had no access to those archival records at the time they collected the interviews, on the other. The same specific behavior, described in strikingly similar terms, surfaces in two unconnected bodies of evidence separated by more than 200 years and an ocean. That kind of independent corroboration is exactly what separates genuine historical pattern from coincidental resemblance, and it is why serious historians treat the Friday evening candle tradition as one of the most reliably diagnostic markers of crypto-Jewish domestic practice in the entire archival and ethnographic record. A second well-documented category of evidence involves dietary practice, and it is in many ways the easiest kind of evidence for historians to find, because the Inquisition's own interrogators were trained to ask about it directly. Inquisitorial manuals from the period instruct examiners to inquire specifically about whether a suspect's household avoided pork, whether meat was salted and soaked or otherwise drained of blood before cooking in a manner resembling kosher slaughter practice, and whether dairy and meat dishes were kept separate at meals, all practices with no equivalent significance in ordinary Iberian Catholic cuisine of the period, and all practices that show up repeatedly in trial confessions as evidence prosecutors considered damning. Among the descendant communities later studied in places like Belmonte in northern Portugal, where an entire town secretly maintained Jewish identity for nearly 5 centuries, openly re-emerging only in the 1970s after Portugal's authoritarian government fell, researchers found specific surviving practices that had been maintained with remarkable fidelity despite total isolation from any organized Jewish community. Families in Belmonte continued avoiding pork even while attending Catholic Mass every week, continued certain methods of preparing meat that closely tracked kosher slaughter requirements, and continued treating particular foods like leavened bread during a specific spring period that lined up closely with Passover as something to be avoided for reasons no living member of the community could articulate in religious terms. When anthropologists eventually documented Belmonte's hidden Jewish community in detail during the 20th century, what they found was not a community consciously practicing Judaism with theological understanding, but a community that had preserved an intricate skeleton of Jewish ritual law stripped almost entirely of the explanatory religious content that would have made its origin and purpose clear, even to the people performing it. The form had outlasted the explanation by centuries. Genealogists working with families in the American Southwest report a similar, if generally less intact pattern. Families who recall a grandparent who would not eat pork despite no religious objection to other foods, or who insisted on a particular and otherwise unexplained method of preparing meat, treated as a fixed family habit rather than a religious observance, surviving as pure custom long after any conscious connection to its origin had been severed. Stars hidden in the stone. A third category of evidence is physical and durable in a way that oral custom and dietary habit are not: cemetery iconography. Researchers surveying old Catholic cemeteries in northern New Mexico, southern Colorado, and parts of rural Portugal and Spain have repeatedly documented gravestones bearing symbols that have no place in conventional Catholic funerary art, but that carry clear and specific meaning within Jewish tradition. 6-pointed stars worked subtly into decorative stonework, where a casual observer might mistake them for ordinary geometric ornamentation. Carved hands positioned in the distinctive split-finger gesture associated with the Kohanic priestly blessing described in the Hebrew. Bible and burial orientations, or stone placements that depart from standard Catholic practice in ways consistent with Jewish burial custom. Stanley Hordes and other researchers cataloging cemeteries across northern New Mexico found dozens of examples of this kind of symbolism on the headstones of families with documented converso surnames, often on graves dating from the 19th century, long after any organized Jewish community existed anywhere near these isolated mountain villages, and in a cultural environment where the families involved would have had no exposure to mainstream Judaism through which to consciously adopt Jewish symbolism as an affectation. The symbols appear, in other words, precisely where the historical and genealogical evidence already independently suggests crypto-Jewish ancestry should be concentrated, which is the kind of convergence that makes researchers take the pattern seriously, rather than dismissing it as coincidental stonemason flourish. Critics of this evidence note, fairly, that 6-pointed star motifs appear in decorative folk art across many cultures for purely ornamental reasons unrelated to Judaism, and that any individual gravestone bearing such a symbol proves nothing on its own. But the priestly hand gesture is a considerably harder symbol to explain away as coincidence, since it has no independent decorative tradition outside of Jewish funerary and synagogue art, and its repeated appearance on stones belonging to families independently documented through archival surname research, as likely converso. Descendants is the kind of convergent evidence that cannot be waved away by a single alternative explanation. The stonemason who carved that gesture into a Catholic family's grave in a remote New Mexico mountain village in 1887 was either conscious of its origin or acting on the instructions of a family that was, and either possibility carries the same historical implication. The names the Inquisition wrote down. The fourth category of evidence is genealogical and archival rather than cultural, and it is in some ways the most exhaustively documented of all because the Spanish and Portuguese Inquisitions kept extraordinarily meticulous written records of exactly whom they prosecuted, for what specific behaviors, and under what family names. Genealogists working with these records, held today primarily in archives in Mexico City, Lisbon, and Madrid, have compiled extensive lists of specific surnames that appear repeatedly in converso prosecution records. Surnames carried by families formally identified by Inquisition tribunals as being of confirmed or strongly suspected Jewish descent. These records, combined with later colonial-era census and parish documents, allow genealogists to trace specific family lines from named individuals prosecuted or investigated for Judaizing in 16th and 17th century Mexico forward through subsequent generations, as those families migrated north into the remote frontier provinces of New Spain, eventually settling the villages of what is now northern New Mexico, precisely because the frontier was far enough from the Inquisition's main tribunals to offer a measure of safety. Genealogist Jeannie Milgram, working from her own family's documented descent from confirmed conversos prosecuted by the Inquisition, was able to trace an unbroken maternal lineage back more than 15 generations to a specific Sephardic Jewish ancestor in 15th century Spain, using archival records that named individual prosecuted ancestors by name, generation after generation, a feat of documentary genealogy that would be impossible without the Inquisition's own obsessively detailed paperwork. This is, in an odd historical irony, some of the best preserved genealogical evidence available anywhere in the world for any persecuted population, precisely because the institution doing the persecuting kept such thorough written records of exactly whom it was persecuting and why. The same bureaucratic machinery that destroyed so many lives produced, as a byproduct, a documentary trail so detailed and so systematically organized that it has survived wars and fires and the indifference of centuries to become, for families today, the most direct available route back into a history they were never supposed to know they had. Families today, researching their own surnames against published converso surname lists and digitized Inquisition trial archives can, in a meaningful number of cases, trace a specific documentary line connecting their own family name to a formally recorded instance of Inquisition prosecution for secret Jewish practice centuries ago. The fifth category of evidence is genetic, and it represents the most scientifically rigorous and most recently developed line of inquiry into crypto-Jewish ancestry. Population geneticists have identified a set of Y chromosome markers, commonly referred to as the Cohen modal haplotype, that occur at unusually high frequency among men who identify as belonging to the Kohanim, the hereditary Jewish priestly lineage traditionally traced back to the biblical figure of Aaron, and that occur at meaningfully elevated frequency among Sephardic Jewish populations, more broadly compared to general European or Iberian populations. A study published in the early 2000s examining Y chromosome markers among self-identified Hispano men in New Mexico and Colorado, men with no conscious awareness of Jewish ancestry, drawn from communities whose oral traditions and surname patterns had already attracted the attention of historians like Hordes, found that a measurable percentage carried Y chromosome markers consistent with Sephardic Jewish paternal lineage at frequencies significantly higher than would be expected by chance in a general Iberian-descended population. The study's authors were careful, as serious geneticists generally are, to note that Y chromosome haplotype frequencies indicate probable shared ancestry rather than certain individual descent, and that the specific markers studied, while elevated among Sephardic populations, are not exclusive to them. But the statistical pattern itself, a meaningfully elevated frequency of specific Sephardic-associated markers concentrated in exactly the communities that independent archival and cultural evidence already pointed to, is difficult to explain as pure coincidence. Mitochondrial DNA studies, which trace maternal rather than paternal lineage, have produced complementary findings among some Latin American and Iberian populations, identifying specific maternal haplogroups associated with known Sephardic Jewish populations at frequencies that exceed what background migration patterns alone would predict. As with the Y chromosome research, the maternal evidence is probabilistic and population level rather than a definitive genetic test for any single individual, and responsible geneticists are consistently explicit about that limitation in their published work. The significance of the genetic evidence lies not in its ability to tell any particular person with certainty that they are of Jewish descent, but in its ability to confirm at the population level that the historical dispersal and subsequent assimilation of Sephardic Jewish ancestry into the Iberian and Ibero-American population was real, was substantial, and left measurable biological traces that are still detectable more than 500 years later. A sixth, less obvious but medically well-established category of evidence involves founder-effect genetic conditions, inherited disorders that occur at unusually high frequency within a specific population because that population descends, at some point in its history, from a relatively small and somewhat genetically isolated ancestral group, a phenomenon population geneticists call the founder effect. Ashkenazi Jewish populations are the most widely known example, carrying elevated rates of conditions, including Tay-Sachs disease and specific hereditary BRCA1 and BRCA2 mutations associated with increased breast and ovarian cancer risk, both well documented in decades of peer-reviewed medical genetics research and now standard considerations in clinical genetic counseling for patients of confirmed Ashkenazi descent. Sephardic Jewish populations carry their own distinct, though less extensively studied, set of founder mutations, and geneticists working with Hispano and Latino populations in the American Southwest and parts of Latin America have identified specific hereditary conditions occurring at elevated frequency that researchers link to descent from the same Sephardic founder populations implicated in the broader crypto-Jewish ancestry research. Families with a documented multi-generational history of a specific hereditary condition known to be associated with Sephardic founder. Populations, combined with surname and regional evidence already pointing toward converso ancestry, represent a meaningful convergence of medical genetic evidence with historical and archival evidence that is difficult to account for through any explanation other than shared ancestry. Medical geneticists who work in this space are careful to emphasize correctly that the presence of any single hereditary condition in a family proves essentially nothing about that family's specific ancestry on its own, since most such conditions occur at lower frequency across many different populations. The evidentiary value lies entirely in the statistical convergence, a known founder mutation appearing in a family that independent historical, surname, and cultural evidence already suggests descends from conversos, rather than in the medical genetics functioning as a standalone test. A family does not discover its ancestral identity through a diagnosis, but a diagnosis, appearing in the right context alongside the right constellation of other evidence, can be one more thread in a fabric that, taken whole, is considerably more revealing than any single strand. The seventh and final category of evidence is the softest in evidentiary terms, but often the first thing that sends a family looking into its own history in the first place: persistent oral folklore, usually attached to a specific older relative, claiming some version of Jewish or Spanish Jewish ancestry, frequently phrased in vague and slightly embarrassed terms. A grandmother who would occasionally say the family had come from Spain before it was Spain like it is now, or who used a handful of Hebrew or Ladino words in private family speech without any awareness of their origin, or who told children, almost as a throwaway aside, that the family had once been Jewish a long, long time ago before any of us, without ever elaborating further or explaining how she knew. Folklorists and oral historians working with Hispano communities in New Mexico documented this pattern extensively throughout the 20th century, finding that families, who eventually turned out, through independent archival surname research, to carry documented converso ancestry, frequently also carried exactly this kind of vague inherited family legend, passed down by a specific matriarchal figure, treated by other family members as eccentric or unverifiable, and generally dismissed for generations as harmless old country superstition rather than literal historical. Memory. The folklore alone proves nothing. Family legends about exotic or distinguished ancestry are common across cultures and frequently turn out, on closer investigation, to be invented or badly garbled. But researchers working in this field have come to treat persistent, specific, multi-generational oral testimony of this particular kind vague. A Jewish ancestry folklore attached to a specific family line, especially when that folklore predates any modern public interest in crypto-Jewish history that might have introduced the idea from outside, as a legitimate starting point for archival investigation, and one that has, in a meaningful number of documented cases, eventually been corroborated by independent surname, archival, and genetic evidence. The specific linguistic traces are worth examining separately, because they represent a category of oral evidence with unusual evidentiary weight. Ladino, the Judeo-Spanish language, spoken by Sephardic Jewish communities before 1492 and carried into the diaspora afterward, contains specific vocabulary, idiomatic expressions, and phonological features that are distinguishable from standard Spanish and that have been documented persisting in isolated pockets of Hispano speech in the American Southwest in forms that are difficult to explain as ordinary Spanish linguistic evolution. A family in which specific words, phrases, or diminutive forms survive in domestic speech that correspond not to standard Castilian Spanish but to documented Ladino usage is in possession of linguistic evidence that complements the archival and cultural record in a way that is, again, difficult to explain by coincidence alone when it appears alongside the other markers described here. It is worth being precise here about what historians, genealogists, and geneticists working in this field are actually claiming, because the temptation to overstate the certainty of any individual piece of evidence is real, and the consequences of doing so are not trivial. No single sign on this list, not a candle lit on Friday, not a star carved into an old gravestone, not an elevated frequency of a specific genetic marker, not a family legend about Spain, proves on its own that a given family descends from forcibly converted Jews. Surname overlap can be coincidental. Dietary customs can have other explanations. Genetic markers associated with Sephardic populations are not exclusive to them and indicate probability rather than certainty. Researchers in this field, including Hordes and Milgram and the population geneticists who have published on Hispano-Y chromosome and mitochondrial DNA patterns, have been consistently and explicitly careful about this limitation in their published work. What the cumulative evidence does support, and what mainstream historians of the Iberian Inquisitions and Sephardic diaspora now broadly accept, is that a meaningful number of families across Spain, Portugal, Mexico, the American Southwest, and other parts of Latin America descend, at least in part, from Jewish ancestors who converted under duress during the 15th, 16th, and 17th centuries, and that a smaller but still significant number of those families preserved fragments of Jewish practice, knowingly or unknowingly across many subsequent generations of forced Catholic identity, the convergence of independent evidence, archival surname records, Inquisition trial documentation, surviving domestic and dietary custom, cemetery iconography, population genetics, founder effect medical genetics, and persistent oral tradition, all pointing toward the same families in the same regions, is what gives this research its credibility, in much the same way that no single anomaly at an archaeological site proves anything but a convergence of independent anomalies starts to demand serious explanation. Skeptics within the historical and genetic research community caution against a different but related risk. The popularization of crypto-Jewish ancestry research has, in recent decades, produced a wave of amateur genealogical enthusiasm in which families, with only the thinnest threads of supporting evidence, a surname that merely sounds plausible, a half-remembered family story, a personal sense of cultural affinity, sometimes leap to confident claims of confirmed Jewish ancestry that the actual archival and genetic record does not support. Serious researchers in this field are emphatic that the 7 categories of evidence described here function as a body of converging probability, not as a checklist where any single item constitutes proof, and that responsible investigation of a family's potential crypto-Jewish ancestry requires the kind of patient, multi-source archival, and genetic work that historians like Hordes and Milgram actually conducted, rather than the recognition of a single suggestive detail in isolation. What makes this field of research genuinely significant, beyond its value to the individual families investigating their own histories, is what it reveals about the durability of human memory and custom. Under conditions of extreme and sustained persecution, families maintained fragments of an identity they were forbidden on pain of death from openly claiming for periods stretching across 15, 20, in some documented cases more than 25 generations, often without any conscious understanding of what they were preserving or why. The candle lit in the back room, the meat soaked and salted just so, the small carved hand on a great-grandmother's. Headstone, the half-understood Ladino word that survived in a household where no one any longer knew what language it came from, these were never meant to be evidence for historians 5 centuries later. They were simply what a family did, quietly, generation after generation, because that is what families do with what they have been given, even when what they have been given is so old and so buried that the living no longer know its name. Until the people who finally went looking for an explanation found that the explanation had been hiding in plain sight and in their own habits the entire time.